It was the summer of 1944. Europe trembled beneath the rumble of Allied tanks, and in the skies above France, the thunder of engines signalled something the world had never seen before: total air dominance. In the days after D-Day, when the beaches of Normandy still burned and the hedgerows were soaked in smoke, thousands of German soldiers were captured. Among them were men who had built Hitler's airfields, engineers, mechanics, Luftwaffe ground crews, men who once believed the Reich's war machine was unmatched. They expected punishment, hunger, humiliation. Instead, they were handed blueprints and shovels. They were told to build across Britain and as far away as Texas and Kansas fenced in. Camps filled with German prisoners buzzed with the sound of construction. Under guard towers and barbed wire, they laid concrete, drove bulldozers, and graded runways for American bombers. To the prisoners, it felt surreal. They had come to destroy these enemies, and now they were helping them fly. But something unexpected began to happen. The Germans watched as Allied engineers moved with precision, speed, and scale beyond imagination. Entire airfields rose from empty fields in weeks. Machines did the work of hundreds of men. Materials arrived in endless convoys. The rhythm of Allied industry was relentless, mechanical, organized, and efficient, and slowly the realization set in the Reich they thought had the best minds and the most advanced technology. But here, behind enemy lines, they saw a different truth. The Allies were operating in another century. How did it come to this? How did the men who built Hitler's airfields end up helping their enemies construct the very runways that sealed Germany's defeat? And what did they discover about Allied engineering that left them stunned even decades later? This is the story of the German POWs who helped build Allied airfields and admitted the enemy's engineering was decades ahead. In the weeks following the invasion of Normandy, Allied forces captured more than 100,000 German soldiers. Among them were not only infantrymen, but the silent machinery behind the Luftwaffe aircraft, technicians, civil engineers, and construction troops from the TOT organization. Many of these men had built airstrips for the Reich's fighters and bombers on the Eastern Front. They had labored with picks, spades, and hand-rolled carts, often under the roar of Soviet artillery. To them, the idea of mechanized airfield construction was unthinkable. But the Allies had different plans for their new prisoners. The British Ministry of Works and the US Army Corps of Engineers quickly realized that many German POWs possessed technical skills far too valuable to waste sitting idle behind wire. So, under the Geneva Convention, which allowed POW labor in non-military roles, they were assigned to construction projects, roads, farms, and most notably airfields. At first, the Germans thought it was a trick. In one camp in Lincolnshire, a Luftwaffe engineer wrote in his diary, "They gave us a machine I could not name. It flattened the earth in minutes. We stood in silence watching." He was describing a Caterpillar bulldozer. To men who had spent years building with shovels and sweat, the sight was almost absurd. Within days of arriving at Allied sites, German POWs were witnessing an industrial ballet. Dozens of heavy machines moved in harmony. Graders, cutting precise slopes, dump trucks forming perfect embankments, concrete mixers churning endlessly. The pace was unlike anything in the Reich's war construction system, which, despite its sophistication, still depended heavily on manpower and improvisation. The Germans had thought they knew efficiency. They didn't. One British officer recalled, "They worked hard, but they watched harder. You could see it in their faces. They couldn't believe how little we relied on men and how much we relied on machines." Slowly, curiosity overcame resentment. Some POWs began sketching the machinery to their notebooks. Others asked questions, cautious at first, then eager. They saw bulldozers with interchangeable blades, concrete mixers mounted on trucks, and portable lighting systems for night work. They saw engineering that didn't just aim to finish the job, it aimed to multiply time. The Reich had built monuments, the Allies were building systems, and the prisoners standing under foreign flags began to realize which philosophy was winning the war. By autumn of 1944, The war had turned decisively against Germany. The Allies were advancing across France, and the skies above Europe were thick with aircraft bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, all demanding constant construction of new airstrips and supply bases. Yet manpower was stretched thin. Millions of American and British men were already overseas, fighting or preparing for invasion duties. The solution? Use the enemy's own labor within the bounds of the Geneva Convention. The arrangement was simple but deeply. Symbolic German POWs would work under Allied supervision, performing non-combat construction. They were paid a small wage, fed adequately, and protected by international law. In return, the Allies gained thousands of skilled laborers who could help expand the airfield network that fueled their dominance. In the US, the War Department classified such efforts as rehabilitation labor. In Britain, it was quietly called the practical use of captives. From the outside, the camps looked like any other military site. Rows of wooden barracks, guard towers, barbed wire fences. But every morning convoys of trucks lined up to collect teams of prisoners. They were taken to construction zones, sometimes a half-finished runway in the English countryside, sometimes a massive bomber base being built from scratch. Each team was assigned Allied supervisors. Often US Army engineers or Royal Air Force ground staff orders were given in broken English and gestures. Some German officers tried to protest, insisting they were not laborers but soldiers, but soon practicality overtook pride. Under the watchful eyes of guards, the prisoners learned a new rhythm of work. Bulldozers roared, graders hummed, and the tempo of Allied construction became hypnotic. For many Germans, this was their first encounter with industrial mechanization on such a scale. A Luftwaffe technician captured near Caen later wrote, "The Americans used machines as if they were extensions of their own hands. We used men as if they were machines. The difference was not just in tools, but in philosophy." The Allied approach to engineering was systemic, planned, rehearsed, and deeply logistical. Every piece of equipment had a purpose, every team a timetable. The Germans had relied on improvisation, genius solving problems under pressure. The Allies relied on process removing problems before they ever appeared. Prisoners began to notice this subtle but powerful divide. They were used to scarcity, forced innovation, and working until exhaustion. But here they saw abundance, an almost endless supply of fuel machinery and coordination, and beneath that they saw something more intimidating than any weapon, the organization at scale. Even under guard, many POWs couldn't help but feel both envy and admiration. They were watching the enemy not just win battles, but outbuild them, outplan them, and outthink them. In time, this quiet observation would become a lesson many carried home. By late 1944, the German POWs had become part of an extraordinary production line, one they had never imagined. They were now eyewitnesses to the most powerful construction force of the modern age. Allied military engineering. The scale stunned them. Runways appeared where there had been nothing but mud. Fields became air bases in less than 2 weeks, and it wasn't manpower that made it possible. It was machinery planning and a level of technical foresight the Germans simply didn't possess. One American engineer explained to a curious German foreman through an interpreter that the key wasn't strength, it was standardization. Every bolt, beam, and mat had a number. Every airfield had a blueprint that could be replicated anywhere in the world, from France to Burma. The Germans had built custom-made, tailored airstrips for specific needs. The Allies built templates. And at the heart of that efficiency was something the Germans had never seen before. The Marston mat perforated steel planking that could turn a muddy field into a solid runway in hours. Each section was lightweight, easy to connect, and so standardized that hundreds of men could lay them without supervision. POWs watched in disbelief as trucks unloaded stacks of the metal grids and American soldiers connected them like pieces of a child's toy set. Where German airfield construction took weeks of backbreaking work, the Allies achieved the same in a single afternoon. A Luftwaffe engineer captured during the Falaise pocket later wrote in his memoir, "We thought we were engineers, but they were builders of worlds. They made machines do what we made men do." He wasn't exaggerating. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers operated as a self-contained army within the army, complete with survey units, mechanical repair depots, and fuel convoys that fed their machines. Their bulldozers could move 20,000 cubic yards of earth a day. Their graders could level entire fields by the end of one shift. Meanwhile, the German system, though highly skilled, was trapped in the past, reliant on manual calculation, limited mechanization, and supply chains constantly strangled by Allied bombing. As one American engineer remarked, "They had the science, but we had the system." Even the concrete itself told a story. The Allies used portable mixing plants, collapsible units that could be hauled by truck. The Germans mixed by hand or in small batches. To the POWs, it was as if they had entered a new century. Some whispered among themselves, half in awe, half in despair. If we had this, the war might have been different. But that was the cruel irony. The very airfields they were helping to build would send bombers to strike the homeland they once defended. Each runway poured in England or France carried another message to Berlin. The future belonged to those who could build faster. By now, many of the POW engineers no longer looked at Allied machines with resentment, but with respect. They understood what they were witnessing wasn't luck or sheer power. It was evolution, industrial, organizational, and human. As winter crept over Europe in late 1944, Allied dominance in the air was no longer a question. It was a fact. But what few realized at the time was that this supremacy rested not protection only on brave pilots or powerful aircraft, but on the thousands of men, including captured Germans who built the runways beneath them, across Britain. Construction never stopped. In East Anglia, the skies echoed with the deep thrum of B-17 seconds, and B-24 seconds, preparing for missions into the heart of Germany. Beneath those bombers, German POWs laboured quietly, levelling soil and pouring concrete under watchful guards. They built for the enemy, yet in a strange way they were also building for the future. In southern England, entire new bases were appearing almost overnight. What had once been farmland became colossal operations, centres, hangars, controlled, towers, maintenance sheds, all linked by endless runways. The Americans called them Airfields, the Germans called them cities of metal. On the continent, after the liberation of France, the tempo only increased. Portable Allied engineering units, often with POW labour attached, followed advancing troops, creating makeshift landing strips for fighters and transports. Some runways were operational within 48 hours of an area being secured. The German POWs assigned to these tasks could hardly believe it. In the Reich, even the most urgent field airstrips took weeks, sometimes months, to complete. Here, it happened between sunrise and sunset. One captured Luftwaffe engineer remembered standing on a French field as bulldozers roared past, saying quietly to a fellow prisoner, "This is how they conquered the sky." And he was right. Airfields were the arteries of the Allied war effort. Without them, bombers couldn't reach their targets, fighters couldn't escort them, and supplies couldn't flow. Every stretch of concrete laid by German hands made that system stronger. For the POWs, there was an unspoken understanding. The war they had once believed Germany could win was already lost, not because of courage or weapons, but because of infrastructure. Allied commanders understood this well. General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, once said, "Air power is only as strong as the ground beneath it," and the ground beneath it was being built by men who had once sworn to destroy it. There were moments of bitter reflection. Some prisoners worked silently, eyes fixed on the dirt. Others, especially engineers, couldn't hide their fascination. They watched, studied, memorized, knowing that every new tool, every technique, was a glimpse into a future they had never imagined. And when night fell, they looked up, seeing the very planes they'd built for streaking toward the horizon, bound for their homeland. It was a cruel symmetry and a lesson none would forget. By early 1945, the German POW labour system had become a strange mirror of the world they once fought to conquer. Inside, the wire discipline still ruled. Salute the order, the hierarchy. Outside it, efficiency, reigned blueprints, schedules, and machines that didn't salute anyone. The two worlds collided every morning at the job site. To the Americans and British supervisors, work was about output. To the Germans, it was about process. The prisoners arrived on time, tools, clean posture, straight military precision intact. But when they saw Allied engineers skipping steps, cutting through bureaucracy, or trusting machines more than men, confusion spread among them. Some whispered, "They don't respect the work," while others replied, "No, they've mastered it." Allied foremen noticed it too. They admired the Germans' discipline but grew frustrated with their obsession for perfection in a system built on speed. A U.S. Army engineer Corporal William Hart later recalled in a letter home, "The German workers are proud but curious. They take apart our graders when we're not looking just to see how they run. They think we're careless, we think they're slow. Somewhere between the two, the runways get built. That tension between precision and practicality defined their days." Some prisoners, unable to contain their engineer's instinct, began offering suggestions. They pointed out better drainage designs or more efficient use of gravel underlay. A few were quietly acknowledged, even adopted. Others were politely ignored. After all, these were still the enemy. Yet something subtle was changing. Beneath the uniform and the guard towers, professional respect began to form. An American foreman might hand a German engineer a clipboard and ask, "You handle the survey lines today," or a British corporal would joke with a prisoner about whose concrete would crack first in winter. For men raised on propaganda and fear, these moments cracked another kind of barrier, the human one. In one camp in Gloucestershire, an RAF engineer remembered a German prisoner named Franz, a civil engineer from Hamburg. When the first frost hit, their runway began to crumble at the edges. Franz, unprompted, explained how to mix a lime additive to stabilize the soil. It worked. The officer later wrote, "In that moment, the man was not a prisoner. He was a colleague." These small interactions didn't erase the hatred or the horror of war. But they revealed something more enduring. Curiosity and respect for craftsmanship could bridge even the deepest divides. And behind that quiet cooperation was an unspoken truth. Both sides recognized the Allies weren't winning just with machines, but with mindset. Where the Germans prized mastery, the Allies prized momentum, and by 1945 momentum had already decided the war. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, the barbed wire stayed. For many German POWs, captivity did not end with the surrender. Tens of thousands remained in Allied camps, working, waiting, reflecting. They had entered the war as believers in the Reich's technological superiority in the myth of German engineering as the pinnacle of modernity. But after months of watching Allied construction firsthand, many began to question everything they thought they knew. In the years that followed, those thoughts surfaced in letters, memoirs, and quiet conversations back home. 1. Former Luftwaffe technician returned to Germany in 1947 wrote to his wife, "I learned more about building in 1 year as a prisoner than in 10 under the Reich." He described machines that didn't break roads, that didn't flood, and systems that didn't stop when one man failed. To him, the Allies' secret wasn't better steel or smarter engineers. It was organization, a kind of invisible weapon that multiplied every ounce of strength. Many POWs brought those lessons home. In the ruins of post-war Germany, as cities struggled to rebuild, men who had once worn field grey now stood on construction sites again, this time under a new flag, armed not with rifles, but with ideas borrowed from their former captors. They spoke of standardized parts, centralized planning, mass production, and efficiency through teamwork, and those ideas, seeded in prison camps and airfields abroad, quietly influenced the rebuilding of West Germany's infrastructure. Historians later noted a striking connection between the post-war German economic miracle and the generation of engineers who had witnessed Allied methods firsthand. They carried back not shame, but a strange kind of gratitude, not for defeat, but for what it revealed. One POW, years later, summed it up simply in an hour. Interview. "We thought we were the masters of machines, but the Americans had made machines into masters of men, and that was the difference. To many it was a humbling truth. They had seen the future, and it had been built by their enemies. Yet that very realization helped reshape the path of post-war Europe. From autobahns to airports, bridges to factories, echoes of Allied engineering, philosophy would ripple through Germany's rebirth. War had taught them the cost of arrogance. Peace would teach them the value of adaptation. Years after the war ended, the noise of engines no longer meant fear. Airfields, once guarded by barbed wire and rifles, became quiet places of travel and commerce, where bombers had once risen toward battle. Passenger jets now carried families and businessmen across the same runways that German POWs had helped to build. Time had turned instruments of war into foundations of peace. For the men who had lived through it, the memory never faded. Some returned to those sites in later decades, older, greyer, standing at the edge of a runway they'd once poured by hand. They remembered the guards, the bulldozers, the cold mornings, and they remembered the realization that came slowly, painfully, but undeniably. They had lost not because they were weak, but because they were outbuilt. The Allies' victory was forged not only in factories or skies, but in the way they built with speed, precision, and unity. The POWs had seen that up close, had measured it. In concrete and steel, in the efficiency of supply convoys, and the rhythm of machines that never tired. In those lessons lay the blueprint for what would come next. When Germany rose again from the ashes, it was guided by men who had once been prisoners. Men who understood that progress was not born from pride but from learning. A former POW engineer put it best when he stood at Frankfurt Airport decades later and watched a jet climb into the clouds. He whispered, "I saw this. Future once behind a fence." From enemies to builders, from war to reconstruction, the legacy of those airfields endures. They are silent witnesses to a moment in history when defeat became education, and the tools of war built the foundations of peace. Because in the end, even in the shadow of destruction, human hands will always find a way to build again.